Hey y'all, this is Brown at I have Brown, and just want to say happy Friday, and also was going to make a little video here talking about AI art and the Suicide Squad. So I have an app on my phone called Starry AI, and it's something I messed around with, and I mean, I don't like have a major profile or anything like that. In fact, I don't think I even have a username, but I just goof around, and I haven't published anything, but sometimes I get some good pictures going, and I think it's fascinating how sometimes depending on what kind of prompt you put in, the artwork that the app turns out, I mean, sometimes it's pretty close to what you're thinking of in your head, but also there are times where it's just way off target. And like, it's not a bad picture, but you're like, that is nowhere near what I had in mind. But I mean, sometimes though, like when it works, I mean, one instance I think that worked rather well was I put in something like Charles Bronson as Han Solo in Star Wars, and it actually turned out some good pictures of that. I mean, it was the same uniform that Harrison Ford wore as Han Solo, but it was Charles Bronson's face. But the thing is, it looked natural. And so, I mean, every now and then you get good stuff like that. But at other times, I mean, it'll be like, I mean, yeah, the picture's fascinating, but the proportion of the body is way off if you're trying to go for people, things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's been fun. It has been. But one of the things I recently messed around with was, say, what I would consider the ideal cast for either a Suicide Squad movie or a TV series, and namely drawing from the cast of characters of the Suicide Squad from, say, the 80s and 90s, and maybe with one or two characters from the New 52 version. But for the most part, I'm thinking of the characters from the John Ostrander run from the 80s and 90s. And by the way, if you get a chance, and if you're a comic book fan, and if you're a Suicide Squad fan, whether it be the comic books or the movies, and you haven't had a chance to check out the John Ostrander run, I would highly recommend it, because you have a lot of lesser known characters who gained a lot of prominence and relevance because of the series. I mean, characters like Bronze Tiger, Deadshot, Captain Boomerang, and then of course you had Amanda Waller and Rick Flag, who are basically kind of like considered the faces of the Suicide Squad. And so, I mean, just do yourselves a favor and check it out. I mean, it's available in trade paperback format, so you can definitely read the whole series without having to, say, scrounge around and look for all the individual issues. But in my case, though, I lucked out a long time ago and was able to gain all the issues, and so I literally have the whole series, including a couple of crossovers and and the annual it had. But so yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I'm proud to have. It's a comic book series that is one of my absolute favorites, and I could sit down and reread it just about any time, because there's always something good to find there. But yeah, so yeah, when I was messing around with the Starry AI and trying to get pictures of certain actors as certain characters from the Suicide Squad, a lot of the pictures, I mean, they were good, but they were not what I had in mind. Like, there would be, say, certain actors who, like, it looked like them, but it looked like them, say, now, as opposed to, say, back in the 80s or 90s. And so, like, at one point, I had one actor as one character, but I tried to specify in the 80s, and it basically ended up making them look like they were, I mean, it was a good picture of them, with some sort of a comic book looking, garb on, but it made them look like that they were pushing 80, not it was in the 80s or from the 80s. And so I was like, darn it, but I mean, a couple of them actually did, turn out like, whoa, that not only looks like that actor, but it looks like that actor as that character. I mean, a couple of them came out okay, but a lot of them I noticed as far as how they looked, it looked like how they look today. So, I mean, if you had a Suicide Squad made up of, people, who were up there in age, that's not quite, what you'd think of, when, you hear the term Suicide Squad, most likely. I mean, especially, you see, either the comics or, the movies that, for the most part, they're relatively younger. With a couple of them being, say, 30 or 40 or maybe pushing 50, but still in good shape, mind you. Okay, so with that little, experiment that had some mixed results, I just wanted to go ahead and say, okay, here's my ideal, cast for a Suicide Squad movie or TV series or web series or whatever they're going for these days. But there was a woman that I wouldn't have even thought of, without one of my friends telling me about her. But there was a woman named Nell Carter, who was on a TV show called Give Me a Break, and she was mainly a comedic actress. But I've seen some clips from her, you just from looking online and what have you, where she's pretty confrontational in certain scenes that she's in, on either Give Me a Break or whatever other show that I was able to find a clip on. But my friend, though, was basically telling me about her and saying that if she were still alive today, I mean, she'd probably be able to pull that off. And so and I will say that Nell Carter, when I put her in as Amanda Waller in the Suicide Squad from DC Comics, I mean, the prompt, it actually turned out some good artwork, or it went into the app, and the artwork actually came out looking pretty good. It looked like Nell Carter as Amanda Waller, and I was like, damn, that's pretty good. And I showed it to my friend. He's like, yeah, that's pretty good. So yeah, Terrence, in the event that you happen to see this, thanks a lot for introducing me to her, so to speak. So Nell Carter as Amanda Waller. I mean, if they were making a Suicide Squad movie in the 80s or 90s, or TV show from the 80s or 90s, Nell Carter as Amanda Waller would be a pretty cool choice. And then for Rick Flag, Michael Biehn. So some people might say, oh, that's typecasting, because I mean, he's played the soldier character so many times. But the thing is, I mean, he's very good at it. I mean, it's a role that he's played many times before, but he's got down. And with each big signature role he has as a soldier, whether it be Terminator, Aliens, or The Abyss, or even The Rock, I mean, he adds a different layer of complexity, or he always brings something different. So I mean, yeah, he might be playing a Navy SEAL in this movie or a Navy SEAL in that movie, but there are distinctions from one another. So I mean, and also Rick Flag is the kind of character who is a skilled field operative and an excellent leader in combat, but he also has quite a bit of psychological baggage that as the comic book series went into its second year, you saw this baggage eating away at him until, unfortunately, there were some tragic consequences. And so with that in mind, I'm thinking of Michael Biehn's performance in The Abyss. I mean, and that's a movie that you definitely want to see a director's cut on, just saying. But for his part in The Abyss, the character he plays, I mean, the first time I saw it, as a little kid, I'm thinking that he's the bad guy and that's it. But when I was older and I saw it again, I saw that, I mean, yeah, he was technically the antagonist, but he wasn't actually a bad guy. Like, he was someone who was going through a traumatic situation that he was unprepared for, and there was like a medical condition that he ended up having and not disclosing, and it ended up having bad consequences for everyone, and especially for his character. And so I saw that, and then I saw his heroic performances in Aliens and Terminator, and I mean, yeah, he once again he's able to play a character in those movies as well who's in over their heads, but they're able to try and adapt to the situation as best as they could, and basically give the other main characters a fighting chance. And so I mean, with all that in mind, I just think that if we're going with an 80s or 90s version of the Suicide Squad for a movie or TV show, I mean, Michael Biehn would be perfect as Rick Flag. I mean, Michael Biehn as he was in the 80s or 90s. So as far as Bronze Tiger goes, okay, so the only person I could think of from the 80s or 90s off the top of my head that would actually fit the part physically was Carl Weathers. And we're talking, say, Carl Weathers in between, say, Rocky 2 and, maybe Action Jackson. But thing is, you look at him in Rocky 2, I mean, that, and I know that was more in the 70s, but it was pushing 80s, and then he had Rocky 3, and he was still in good shape, right? And hell, he was even in good shape in Rocky 4, but of course, sadly, we all know how, his character, ended up going out in that movie. But point is, Carl Weathers was a guy who, in the 80s, I mean, he was in great shape. And so, when he got in the ring, you believed he could fight, especially with Rocky 2, right? I remember with Rocky 2, it got to a point where, I mean, of course, I mean, it's Rocky's movie and you're rooting for Rocky, but at the same time, when you see, Apollo's, motivation in that particular movie, and you see Carl Weathers bring the intensity to the role, both, psychologically and physically, like when he's going through the character's emotions and when, he's going through the training, I mean, yeah, you believe that this guy could, kick some ass. And to an extent, I kind of find myself more on his side than Rocky's side in that particular movie. I mean, I was more on Rocky's side than Apollo's side, but because of what they did with Apollo's character in that particular movie, and the performance that Carl gave, both, physically and, with the script and everything, I found myself, kind of, going for Apollo at certain points, But the point is, I mean, Carl Weathers, see, I keep wanting to call him Apollo Creed, but Carl Weathers is a guy who, I mean, hell, even look at him in Predator. I mean, you look at him in that movie, I mean, yeah, he didn't have the lion's share of the action scenes, but he was still in great shape, and he, looked like, I mean, yeah, he could handle himself in combat, granted, unless he's against, like, an alien from another world or something like that in that particular movie. But the point is, Carl Weathers as Bronze Tiger, I think, would be a great casting choice, because he was, at this point in time, say in the 80s or 90s, he was in great shape, and he knew how to handle himself in action scenes. And I think that I can't think of anything off the top of my head I've seen him in where he shows some talent for martial arts. Like, it's mainly like, say, boxing or street fighting and things like that. And plus, he has a commanding presence, say, his part in, Predator, or, the TV show In the Heat of the Night. I remember seeing, him on a few episodes of that, and he was, very believable as someone who was a figure of authority. And Bronze Tiger is definitely a figure of authority in the Suicide Squad. And so I think that Carl Weathers, I mean, by the way, rest in peace, Carl Weathers. You were a great actor. That was definitely a sad loss for, a lot of people. But Carl Weathers, I mean, had he been in the Suicide Squad as Bronze Tiger, or had he been picked for a part, I think that he already has, this, physical characteristics down. But I think that, if he went through, say, martial arts training and went into the role, I think that he would have been, perfect as Bronze Tiger, 80s, especially, like, say, in around the 80s, maybe the 90s, but definitely, 80s for sure. So Carl Weathers as Bronze Tiger would have been a great choice. Okay, so there was another character by the name of Nemesis, not as well known, but he was definitely an important member of the squad, in certain storylines, and he was more of like a, sort of master of disguise and espionage expert, and he was also good friends with Batman too. But look at his character in the comic book. A blonde guy, doing spy missions and what have you. And I couldn't. And considering this was from a lot of his appearances were in the 80s. I think that I couldn't help but think of the character of I couldn't think of help but think of Jan Michael Vincent's character, Stringfellow Hawk, from the TV show Airwolf. And you look at him on that particular show. I mean, namely, like in the first and second season. I mean, you see a guy who's really good at selling the notion that he's in the spy trade. And granted, a good amount of the time he's in a helicopter, but when he's not in the helicopter, and when they were able to get a good performance from Jan Michael Vincent, like when his alcoholism wasn't weighing him down, I mean, he actually sold the spy bit rather well, and as well as being able to sort of blend in and hide out in enemy territory and things like that. And so I think that Jan Michael Vincent in his Airwolf days, and but preferably without the alcoholism, of course, I mean, would have been a good choice for the character of Nemesis. And then for the character of Deadshot, I was thinking initially of Charles Bronson, but then I'm like, okay, Charles Bronson's great in the man of few words badass roles, but the thing is, Deadshot, I mean, he's not exactly a man of few words. I mean, he's got a personality that manages to poke through. I mean, it's a rather grim personality, but it has a dark sense of humor, sort of devil-may-care attitude. But he's also a very physical character, like when it comes to, say, combat and what have you, even if he's using firearms. And so I was thinking Burt Reynolds, because Burt Reynolds is an actor who had a lot of stunt training, and whenever he did action scenes, I mean, especially say in the 70s or 80s, I mean, he sold them. Whether they were shootouts or fist fights or street fights. I mean, Burt Reynolds was a guy who knew how to handle himself, in a fight scene, and how to, sell a punch or how to sell taking a punch, as well as, how to, sell, the notion that his character's skilled in firearms, depending on the movie or, show or what have you. But I remember, seeing him in, like, I mean, for the most part, the movies that I remember him from, he tends to be more lighthearted, but there have been a couple of movies I saw him in where there was a bit of an edge to his role. Like even in, say, a movie like The Longest Yard. I mean, it's a great comedy, right? But there's an edge that he has in certain scenes that he brings to the part, and so you see that. And then you see him in, say, something like Deliverance. I know Longest Yard and Deliverance were more in the 70s, okay? So he could definitely, do serious when it called for it, while selling the whole, physical badass, aspect of the characters he was playing. But then there was a movie that he was in called Sharky's Machine, which is a really cool crime drama, and I'd highly recommend checking that one out. And you see him in that movie, and I mean, yeah, he has that sort of, Burt Reynolds, wisecracking, persona with him. I mean, that he, has, because it's just kind of like his natural part of his charisma, right? But there's definitely a darker aspect that he's able to bring to the part. And I kind of wish that, with having seen Burt Reynolds in Sharky's Machine, and seeing that he was capable of, playing a, quote-unquote darker role, I would have loved to have seen him take more roles like that. But in regards to him playing Deadshot, I mean, I think that he would have been a good choice because, I mean, as I said, he knew how to handle himself in a fight scene as well as in, say, a shootout action scene. And he was good in, doing stunts and what have you. But he also, was able to, have, sort of like that devil-may-care attitude that Deadshot has. I think would have been, almost effortless for Burt Reynolds to pull off, because, he excelled at, just, not giving a shit. I mean, on screen. And I mean that in the best way possible, And, for the character of Deadshot, I mean, that would be perfect. And, also, the fact that, the serious bits that, Burt Reynolds was able to, show off at times in some of his work, I mean, I think that it would work well with Deadshot as well, because, I mean, Deadshot, very, grim fellow who excelled in dark humor, but at the same time, I mean, when it was time to be serious, like when you had his, miniseries, the first miniseries that Deadshot had in the 80s, I mean, that was a very, very dark storyline. And so, like, it started off as, some, dark comedy, but then it got really serious and dark rather quickly. So, I mean, it would have been, to see Burt Reynolds, also another, late actor, rest in peace, him and J. Michael Vincent and Carl Weathers, man. But yeah, I would have loved to have seen, Burt Reynolds, try and handle a role like, Deadshot, like Floyd Lawton. I mean, that's Deadshot's real name. But, I mean, what he would have brought to that role would have been great to see. So, let's see, who else have we got? Mia Sara as Enchantress. Now, the reason I say Mia Sara is because she was in one of my absolute favorite 80s fantasy movies, which was Ridley Scott's Legend. And she played, initially, like, she played a benevolent princess who was kind of a damsel in distress, but somewhere along the way, her character ends up, being corrupted by dark forces, and you literally see her change in terms of, say, appearance. And, like, she goes from wearing, like, this, white, gown that gradually gets more and more, torn up and dirty, as the movie goes on, because she's been captured and everything. But then when she gives into the darkness, that she's being seduced by, she literally turns into this, new person. And, like, the costume design on her, it's like this, this dark, black, dress that, looks like it came from the void or something. And the way they made her skin look, like it was, pale. Not like deathly pale, mind you, but like ethereally pale. And she had like black lipstick and everything. And it was a character transformation that, physically, Mia Sara, did great at going from, the benevolent princess who, was in distress to, the princess of darkness, if you will, for a certain amount of time, mind you. But also, just in terms of acting, I mean, she did a really good job of, going from light to dark and then sort of back again, So, and of course, with the character of Enchantress, she's like one of two parts, because you have June Moon, who's, the ordinary human woman who's, basically host to the Enchantress entity. And, June Moon is, a benevolent individual, who's in a situation that, she finds more than a little horrifying. And so, she's trying to cope with things to the best of her abilities, but, it's taken a toll on her. And then when she ends up reluctantly, transforming into Enchantress, that's when, Enchantress, you get to see like the evil aspect of her character, because Enchantress was, if I remember correctly, someone who started off, at least as far as the comics went, she was a semi-benevolent entity, but then I guess maybe being exposed to certain elements of humanity brought out the darker side in her to where it ultimately took over. And so whenever Enchantress was in control, she was probably one of the most powerful members on the team. That is one of the things that the David Ayer Suicide Squad movie got, and that Enchantress was easily one of, if not the most powerful member on the Suicide Squad. But the thing is, it was like she was a ticking time bomb, because whenever she turned into Enchantress, I mean, yeah, she had all this power and she was able to kick the enemy's ass, but it was almost a guarantee that she was going to turn on the team, immediately after she was done. And so they had to have, certain characters, basically keep an eye on her with sort of a fail-safe in place, whether it be, a bullet to the brain, worst case scenario, or say a mystical enchantment or something like that. So, like I said, Enchantress, was a ticking time bomb, to have on the team. And I just think that, to have that kind of dynamic, to go from good to evil and back again, but then maybe have, the good start to be corrupted by the evil because of constant exposure to this, supernatural entity, or maybe, the evil starts to sort of, take on, some good, it's like maybe they start to rub off on each other. I just think that, someone like Mia Sara, especially after having seen her performance in Legend, would have been a great choice for Enchantress. For the character of Nightshade, I'm going to go with Sean Young, and namely, Sean Young as she was in the movie Blade Runner, also another Ridley Scott movie, and also, something I would highly recommend, great science fiction movie. But, seeing her in that movie, and also seeing her in Dune, David Lynch's adaptation of Dune, she showed that she had some, physical capabilities when it came to, say, trying to depict, say, someone who is skilled in combat. And, the character of Nightshade, I mean, she has like this, mystical aspect to her character, but she was also someone who is skilled in physical combat. And so, with the character that Sean Young had to play in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, there was a very ethereal quality to her. Like, there wasn't anything, say, magical necessarily, but at the same time, there was something genuinely otherworldly about her character and the way that she carried herself. And, like, she talks to you, but you feel like you're talking to, someone who's regal, but like they carry themselves with a sense of regalness that, is outright, beyond humanity, I think. I mean, it sounds dramatic and what have you, but you see that movie and you see her character, maybe you can see what I'm talking about. But, Nightshade, from the comics that I remember her from in Suicide Squad, she kind of had that regal bearing, with her. Like, she wasn't like a spoiled princess or anything like that, but because of her character's story, there was an aspect of royalty to her character. And so when she's in the human world, and outside of, her home dimension, when she's in the human world for the majority of the series, I mean, she's able to, carry herself well and blend in with humanity. But at the same time, when it came to, say, her utilizing her abilities in, combat missions, that's when you saw that, I mean, yes, she's on your side, and yes, she's a good person, but there's something eerie about her, because of this otherworldly connection that she has. And so, I mean, unlike the character of Enchantress, Nightshade was firmly on the side of good, but because of the nature of her character's story, and how her realm was basically, corrupted over time by dark forces, I mean, she ended up, basically getting a power boost from those dark forces, and she was able to, basically, conquer them. But, said darkness was, it was already a part of her because of, who she was, but it was basically a natural part of things. Like, it wasn't, say, evil, but because of how things were corrupted in her realm eventually, that evil, it did mark her, but it didn't conquer her. Like, she was able to, use that power, for, in her own, to her own benefit, without herself being corrupted, which was a pretty impressive feat. And so, seeing someone like Sean Young, especially, if we're talking Sean Young as she was in Blade Runner and Dune, that would have been a cool choice, for someone like Nightshade, I think. Let's see, who else have we got? Rutger Hauer as Count Vertigo. So Rutger Hauer is another actor who's really good at conveying a sense of regalness and royalty, and the character of Count Vertigo is a figure of royalty, but he's also someone who is marked by a lot of psychological problems, like I believe it was like bipolar depression. And you see Rutger Hauer in some of his movies, and he's able to play someone who's a straight up badass, and whether he's like on the side of good or evil, but he's also really good at projecting a sense of vulnerability. Like you see him in a movie like Blind Fury, where he's a good guy. I mean, he's vulnerable in the sense that he's blind, but also, there's an aspect of his past that, he's trying to make peace with. And then, of course, you see him in a movie like Blade Runner, which, once again, is a great movie, but you see him in a movie like Blade Runner, and, he's the leader of the bad guys in that movie. And he carries himself, and there is a sense of regalness with his character, even though he's not royalty, but he carries himself like someone who is a leader. But you have, these moments where, he just kind of, breaks down emotionally, because of his character situation and the toll that it's taking on him. And with the character of Count Vertigo, I mean, you saw someone who, was definitely a figure of royalty, and he was also a very powerful individual with his abilities, but you also saw someone who was at the mercy of his disordered mind, and some of the more fascinating parts of the series were whenever he was talking to someone about it, like say if he was in a therapy session or something along those lines. Very fascinating part of the series, and a very believable character as a result. And it was cool to see someone who is mentally flawed be believably handled on page. And I just think that someone like Rutger Hauer would have been really good in a part like Count Vertigo. And sadly Rutger Hauer passed away too, so a lot of dead actors who have been great in a Suicide Squad. Go figure, right? But yeah, Rutger Hauer as Count Vertigo would have been a great choice. Because I mean, he would have carried himself like royalty, and he would have been believable as somewhat of a leader figure. But and also say in the instances of combat, I mean, we've seen him in movies like say The Hitcher, or once again Blind Fury, where he was really good in say action scenes, whether he was on the side of good or evil. But he also had a sense of menace. I mean, with that he was able to bring, like say in Blade Runner or The Hitcher. Like, in Blade Runner, I mean, he was a bad guy and he was a threat, but he was sympathetic. Whereas in The Hitcher, he was just straight up terrifying. But I think that, if you were to play someone like Count Vertigo, who was a villain, if you had him play the part, you'd have someone who was powerful yet vulnerable. I mean, not someone you want to turn your back on necessarily, or trust enough to turn your back on, but someone who's like, this is someone who knows that they have a problem, and they want help for it, but at the same time, their mind's their own worst enemy. And at the same time, this is someone who has a lot of power as well. So very complex, or dangerous but complex figure, and I think Rutger Hauer would have been great in the part. Okay, so another character, Vixen. I think that for her, someone like Pam Grier would have been great for the part. I mean, because she's got a lot of badass mileage from a lot of her work in the 70s, but if they had made Suicide Squad in the 80s and had the role of Vixen for Pam Grier, she would have been fantastic. and I think that, I mean, shoot, even if you look at her in Jackie Brown, which was from the 90s, I mean, she was still badass in the part, I mean, physically and also just in terms of acting too. But seeing someone like Pam Grier as Vixen, I mean, it would be a role that would require a lot of physicality on her part, because, I mean, Vixen is a very physical character, I mean, with her abilities, I mean, I think it was called the Tantu Totem, which allowed her to use the natural abilities of, any animal. Like, say, she could use the strength of an elephant, even though there's no elephant nearby, things, to fight someone, things like that. It would have been cool to see someone like Pam Grier, go for that kind of part, because, I mean, we know she can handle herself in a fight scene, like when it comes to, say, selling a fight scene in some of the action scenes I've seen her in. So seeing Pam Grier do something like that, but in a more comic book setting, would have been really cool. But also, much like Pam Grier, Vixen's a very charismatic and character individual, and a lot of that came from the fact that Vixen, she has a background in the modeling industry, and so there was a sort of seductive quality to her character. And Pam Grier, she could definitely sell the seduction, when it comes to, say, the charismatic aspect of her character. And it just, I just think that Pam Grier as Vixen would have been a cool choice. And plus, it would have been really cool to see, Pam Grier in a comic book setting, because, I mean, she's badass in action movies, and the ones that, I've seen her in. I mean, she even held her own in Above the Law with Steven Seagal, and that was like in the late 80s, so, I mean, Pam Grier as Vixen, would have been a pretty cool choice. I mean, both in terms of, say, physicality, as well as what she would bring to the role in terms of, say, personality as well, and charisma. And then, let's see, Captain Boomerang. You can't have Suicide Squad without Captain Boomerang. This choice might sound a little cliche, but at the same time, considering that we're drawing a lot from the 80s here, when there was that sort of film boom of Australian cinema, or Australian culture in the 80s, the movie Crocodile Dundee was arguably the face of that for a good portion of the 80s. And of course, who do we have playing Crocodile Dundee? Paul Hogan. And so, that is a role that was definitely iconic when it comes to, say, comedy and, Australian, comedy. I guess you could say, I don't remember if Crocodile Dundee, the movie itself, was Australian, even though it took place in Australia. But the fact is, I mean, Crocodile Dundee is someone that a lot of people associate with Australia. Like, they think of Australia, they see his face, and therefore they see Paul Hogan's face. And, he was someone who, definitely had a singular wit, for the part. I mean, Crocodile Dundee had a very, unique personality, and Paul Hogan was the right person to play the part, and he brought that singular wit to life. And in terms of, say, physical, characteristics, I mean, he was someone who, the character, had a lot of, in the way of, say, being able to interact with, his environment and what have you, in such a way to where, it was almost, inhuman at times, like when he's in Australia at one point and he's able to, face down a water buffalo just by, doing that, things like that. And so seeing someone like Paul Hogan play the part of Captain Boomerang, I mean, Captain Boomerang is not a good guy, okay? I mean, so it'd be interesting to see Paul Hogan play someone who was a villain instead of a hero. But considering that, Captain Boomerang himself is Australian, I mean, it would have been interesting to see, say, someone who was, like, kind of in touch with nature in a way, but who was also at home, doing, the dirty work of the Suicide Squad, whether it be, committing straight up crime, for, a cause or, for his own shits and giggles. I mean, seeing someone like Paul Hogan play that kind of part, would have been fascinating to see, because you see Paul Hogan, who is Australian, who's already played an iconic Australian character, playing another character, who's Australian, who, because of his part in the Suicide Squad comic book series, ended up becoming iconic in and of himself. I mean, even if it was as a bad guy. So it would have been cool to see Paul Hogan, and what he could have done in a part like that, because, with him, I mean, you have that distinctive, charm that he would bring to, say, something like Crocodile Dundee, but this time he's doing it as a bad guy. So yeah, Paul Hogan as Captain Boomerang, I would have loved to have seen. Okay, so two other characters I can think of that I would like to see in this particular, version of the Suicide Squad, and who are also attached to the team at one point or another. But as a character a little bit lesser known, but nonetheless she was a part of the team. Her name was Black Orchid, and she very seldom, if ever, said anything whenever she was on the team. I think she may have only said a couple of words here and there, but her physicality spoke for her. Like, she was someone who was very physically strong, and she could fly as well, and she could change, her appearance. So someone who was very handy in the realm of espionage, right? But, if we're talking from the 80s, though, I'm thinking someone like Daryl Hannah for someone like Black Orchid. And the reason I say that is because, if you've seen the movie Splash, there's a good portion of the movie, namely, around the first act, where, she doesn't talk, but she conveys a lot through her physical mannerisms. And you see that this is someone who is new to the surface world, because she's a mermaid, right? But she's new to the surface world and is just, fascinated by everything. But then as, her time with the surface world, gets, more involved, like, she gets to where she's able to learn to talk. And eventually she starts talking like a normal person, but she was someone who was constantly observing things. Like, she had participation in things, like with, things around her, but she was, very good at observing things. And so seeing someone like Daryl Hannah, bring that kind of physicality, to the part of, say, someone like Black Orchid would have been a nice touch, because it would have been a reminder that Daryl Hannah is a very good physical actress. And seeing as how, Black Orchid was a character, or I should say a woman of few words, and Daryl Hannah, up to a certain point in Splash, played someone who was a woman of few words, I think that, the role and, the actor would have gone hand in hand, and it would have been a, nice, performance from Daryl Hannah as this particular character of Black Orchid. So, last but certainly not least, this character is granted from the New 52 version of the Suicide Squad, but the actor, I'm thinking, is more from the 80s or 90s. So the character is El Diablo, okay? He's from the New 52 version of the Suicide Squad, and he was also played rather well on screen in the David Ayer Suicide Squad movie. Unfortunately, I forgot the actor's name who played him, but he was very good in the part. And in fact, I mean, a lot of people who, didn't like the movie itself, they did single, him out, as well as, Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn, as being, one of the, good actors in the movie. So whoever it was that they got to play El Diablo in the Suicide Squad movie, the first one, was very good in the part, okay? So, but if we're talking, like, say, something mostly from the 80s, Lou Diamond Phillips as El Diablo, okay? And I'm thinking Lou Diamond Phillips as he was in the movie Stand and Deliver with Edward James Olmos. Because from what I remember of that movie, it's been a while since I've seen it, but there was a rebellious quality to his character, but as the movie went on, you saw this, there was a goodness to him as well. and eventually the goodness won out, but not at the expense of that rebellious, quality, going away. And so with someone like El Diablo, you have someone who, is definitely a rebel, but also because of, his tragic backstory, and yeah, it's definitely a tragic one. You see that rebelliousness tempered, with humility. And so Lou Diamond Phillips is someone who can play someone. He can play a character, who, is a rebel, but has shades of compassion or humility as well. Heck, if you look at him on the show Longmire, you can probably see what I'm talking about. But I'm mainly talking like, say, as he was in something like Stand and Deliver, So, but yeah, I think that he would have been a good casting choice for the character of El Diablo had they made this in the, the 80s or, maybe early 90s. But yeah, the character of El Diablo, is basically someone who is a powerhouse, already, in terms of, say, straight up, abilities and everything, but also because of the tragedy of of his backstory. He's someone who's reluctant to go all in on his abilities. Like, he's reluctant to go as far and as hard as he can, because of what happened when he got careless. But he's also got that rebelliousness that is still a part of his character. So it's like a balancing act with him. Someone who is trying to be a better person and atone for some of the things he's done, but because of who he is as a person, that rebelliousness is never going to go away. And so Lou Diamond Phillips, though, especially as he was in Stand and Deliver, from what I remember of that, I think would have been a good choice for the character of El Diablo. So yeah, that's those are my thoughts. That's what I think, in terms of, say, who would be a good cast for a Suicide Squad movie or TV show had it been done, say, in the 80s or 90s. But also, I just want to say, like, I would have loved to have seen, if we're talking like Nell Carter as Amanda Waller, it would have been amazing to see her face off with, say, Michael Keaton as Batman, because in a couple of the issues of Suicide Squad, Amanda Waller basically tells Batman what's what. Like, he's initially trying to shut the squad down himself, but Amanda Waller's like, unless you want everyone to know who you really are, Mr. Wayne, this ain't happening. And the way she was written, by John Ostrander, it's like, this woman made Batman shit bricks, okay? So, seeing someone like, Nell Carter, it would have been cool to see her, play that particular scene, because the scene in that particular issue of Suicide Squad, it's like an iconic moment in the series, okay? And so, from what I've seen of Nell Carter, like, when she plays a character getting confrontational, she sells it, okay? And so, seeing her, to see someone like her, play Amanda Waller, facing off with Batman, giving him a verbal smackdown. Especially if, this is the 80s and we got Michael Keaton as Batman, that would have been priceless, okay? So, yeah, those are my thoughts. You got any questions, comments, further, suggestions for this, non-existent movie or TV show from the 80s? By all means, lay them down. So, thank you for taking the time to listen to this if you made it this far. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So, y'all have a good weekend. Take care. Bye.